With the release of Shadowlands on the horizon, I wanted to talk about World of Warcraft's current expansion, Battle for Azeroth. More importantly, what went wrong with it.
There's a lot at stake here!
So before we begin, I want to do a quick recap of the expansion leading up to where it went wrong and why. Fair warning, I played Horde for this one, so it'll be Horde skewed, but the Alliance campaign wasn't very different overall, so that won't really matter. Now, keep in mind, originally, Battle for Azeroth was an expansion that was going to be focused on the feud between the Alliance and the Horde. Of course, that didn't last, but at least we got that cool world PvP option, right? So at the end of Legion, we defeated Sargeras, and as a final fuck you, he decided to plunge a big-ass sword into Azeroth. Now the planet is bleeding magic blood, and we need to find a way to stop the bad guys from using the blood to get super jacked and fuck up our shit. So Magni, who gets to talk to God because he's made out of fucking diamonds, inevitably gives us a magic locket to soak up the magic blood and give us superpowers. Of course, the Horde wants to capitalize on this magic blood, and our champion is more than happy to help both sides for some goddamn reason. Anyway, on to the subplot. Now that the Burning Legion is defeated, the Horde and Alliance are back to hating each other, and Sylvanas really wants to stir shit up. So she burns down the entire goddamn Night Elf homeland. As retaliation, the Alliance tries to take the undead capital, but Sylvanas says fuck you and blows it up before they get the chance. Both sides realize they need some help and decide to find some new allies. So on the Horde side, we meet up with the princess of the Zandalari trolls, Talanji. She wants her father to trust her and to prove to him that his most trusted advisor is plotting against him. I like to call this arc, Talanji has daddy issues. Meanwhile, on the Alliance side, they travel to Borealis so Jaina Proudmoore can get her mom to love her again. All the while, her mom's most trusted advisor is plotting against her. Or, Jaina has mommy issues. Sound familiar? This is the half of the expansion that's pretty good. On either side, you get 3 interesting sprawling zones with interesting questlines and conflicts, as well as a huge hub city that's different for each faction. The Horde gets a cool little castle town with a sick-ass Aztec-like temple with different shops and neighborhoods. And the Alliance gets a big wet city. Now we're on to patch 8.2. So after you do all the war campaign quests you can, both sides decide to set sail and attack each other. Right as they start to close in, a big-ass whirlpool opens up and swallows both sides. We find ourselves in the formerly underwater city of Nazjatar, home of Queen Azshara, ruler of the Naga. Each faction explores the area and aligns with their own choice of fish people. The fish people don't like that Azshara took the water away, and they really don't like Naga in general, so we decide to help them due to our mutual goals. This is where the story starts to shift from the original war focus to a plot that keeps both factions more or less on the same path. The zone itself is super pretty, they introduce an armor mechanic that's obsolete after this patch, but you can ride your water mounts as flying mounts, which is cool as hell. While all that is happening, you also get a questline to discover a secret lab in Kulturas that eventually leads you to the island of Mechagon, home to a bunch of cyborg gnomes. So while everyone is fucking around in Atlantis, the gnomes and goblins arrive on Mechagon and meet Prince Erasmin, who, get this, has daddy issues. Turns out Erasmin's dad, King Mechagon, decided having skin wasn't cool anymore and started turning all the mecha gnomes into full-on subservient robots. Some of the mechanics they added to this area were cool. You get access to junkyard tinkering, which is just engineering everyone can do, and they added a 5-man mythic-only dungeon that was hard as hell but kinda fun. You could also get some pretty cool toys and mounts. As for the actual gameplay in this patch, let's look at Nazjatar first. There's a small chain of regular questing in this area, but the main thing you're gonna do is pick a fish person to accompany you and do dailies. And world quests. And dailies. And world quests. And did I mention dailies? And with Mechagon not being connected to the war campaign, it took an obvious back seat. In this zone, you have 1 world quest you can do a day, then just a bunch of fucking dailies again. Keep in mind, you have to raise your reputation in these zones high enough to even unlock flying for the expansion. And both zones have enemies everywhere, so without flying it becomes even more tedious. So you defeat King Mechagon, and the Mecha Gnomes are happy, but that's pretty much the last you hear of it. Then you do a raid and storm Queen Azshara's palace and kick this very prominent character's ass in 1 patch. And as a final fuck you, she releases the bonds that were keeping the old god, N'Zoth, prisoner. N'Zoth then grabs Azshara's body, brings her back to life, and fucks off for a little while. After all this, you find out that Sylvanas was up to more shady shit, and High Overlord Varrock Sourfang was tired of her leading the Horde to a path with no honor, so he challenged her to a Mat Gara, or a one-on-one traditional Orcish fight to the death. Needless to say, she cheats and kills him with some shadow magic, the Horde turns on Sylvanas, and she fucks off to the next expansion. The Horde and Alliance, both realizing there are bigger fish to fry, form an armistice. Tyrande is pissed because, hello, the Horde killed like 80% of her fucking people, so she fucks off to the next expansion. Now we're leading into patch 8.3. After everything that happened with Azshara, we move back onto the main plotline. Magni calls us to the Chamber of Heart because things have been fucky with Titan devices all over the place, and turns out, N'Zoth decided to upload his malware so he could take over the world. We get told that there's a new advisor that conveniently showed up and conveniently knows way too much about what N'Zoth is doing. That advisor is Rathian, son of Deathwing, and let me tell you, he is hotter than ever. So we do some quests and discover N'Zoth's focus has been in Uldum and the Vale of Eternal Blossoms. After we fuck around there a little bit, we meet up with Prince so he can open a door to a living nightmare that N'Zoth is trying to make a reality. The main mechanic of this part of the expansion is to upgrade a legendary cloak made up of scales of Deathwing's other kids that you killed in older expansions. The more you upgrade the cloak, the better your stats and the slower your character loses their sanity in the nightmares and mini-nightmares. There's also a chance for gear you get from the expansion to have corruptions on them that give you bonuses, but have a negative effect as a trade-off. As your cloak upgrades, you get stronger corruption resistance that negates the negative effects and allows you to wear gear that has stronger bonuses and higher corruption. Now there are two main gameplay elements to this patch. The first one has you travel to Uldum in the Vale of Eternal Blossoms to, you guessed it, do more goddamn dailies. But they decided to spice it up a bit, and instead of world quests, you get to do an assault in each area once a week that can get you some pretty decent gear. There are some small regular quest lines you can do in these areas, but they overall don't matter. Doing these dailies gets you some currency that you can use to purchase an item to access the second thing I wanted to talk about, which are horrific visions. Horrific visions are the nightmares I mentioned earlier, where Rathian opens up a gate and takes you to a nightmare version of either Orgrimmar or Stormwind that's been taken over by N'Zoth and his minions. This is also how you upgrade your legendary cloak. There are 5 bosses in each vision, each of which are important characters from the Alliance or Horde that have succumbed to N'Zoth's corruption. While you're in these visions, you have a sanity meter that goes down over time and goes down faster the more you get hit. The more you upgrade your cloak, the deeper you can go into the vision, the more bosses you can fight, and the slower your sanity drains. Overall, these visions are fun, but they have their own issues. Firstly, you can't just join a queue for them. You have to form your own group ahead of time. On top of that, each person in the group has to have a vessel of horrific visions, which are purchased with the currency I mentioned before. The problem with that is each vessel costs 10,000 of this currency. Most of the dailies give you about 400 or 500 or so a piece, meaning you need to play every day if you want to make progress quickly. You also have the problem of if you're wanting to do multiple runs and the people you're grouping with don't have the same number of vessels as you, you're going to have to find yet another group to run with. My second problem is how repetitive the visions get. You're fighting the same bosses over and over, and you only have those 2 visions you can run. And while they're decently fun and a challenge in and of themselves, I wish there was more variety. So once you get your cloak and gear to where you want them to be, you go to face N'Zoth in the final raid of the expansion, Ny'alotha. You inevitably kick his ass as well, meaning yet another prominent, powerful character is defeated in a single patch. However, the cutscene you get at the end is super fucking cool. Basically, N'Zoth is trying to corrupt you, while Magni is trying to cheer you on and get through to you. Then your magic necklace explodes in light and cleanses the corruption, while Magni focuses a fucking laser through it, effectively disintegrating N'Zoth and freeing the world from his corruption. Now that you're caught up, let's talk about what went wrong.
Job's done.
Some of my largest gripes are with the story. It couldn't decide what story it wanted to tell. It started about the war and then completely shifted, and it felt like what happened in this expansion should have been spread out into about 2 of them. Once we got to Nazjatar, everything shifted to focus on Azshara, then it focused on N'Zoth. Both of them are huge characters, and their conflicts were taken care of in a patch each. Granted, Azshara was saved by N'Zoth, so we'll likely see her come back, and N'Zoth is an old god, so they could easily say he isn't actually dead, but frankly, the second half of the expansion just felt rushed. The gameplay and questing was certainly lacking. All they did was turn it into a time sink and make you feel obligated to play every day, and that gets old very quickly. It's like after they finished Nazjatar, they completely changed direction. Mechagon could have been much larger and more important than it was, and the N'Zoth invasions felt repetitive and unfinished. On top of that, I would have liked an expansion that was supposed to put the war back in Warcraft to have more than 2 Warfront battles. They also never gave you much of a reason to do the island expeditions, and there was a lot of potential there. It also would have been interesting to dive deeper into the footholds you established in the opposing faction zones and maybe cause some kind of plot-related conflict. Although it may not sound like it, I did still enjoy the time I put into Battle for Azeroth. Most of the zones were interesting and they were full of rares that dropped neat toys and mounts, and I even enjoyed a lot of the new mechanics they introduced. But too many mechanics felt underdeveloped and optional, and most of them were very short-lived. They never gave enough of a reason to keep using them, and then they were obsolete by the next patch. My biggest issue overall is the same issue I had with the last two expansions, and that's time gating. They made progression feel like a chore. You'd have to make sure to play every day to risk not falling behind everyone else, and while that model is likely to keep people's subscriptions up, it takes away from the game's quality of life. I don't want to have to go to a table and wait 4 hours to do the next part of my quest. Hopefully, with Blizzard's aim to be more inviting to new players, Shadowlands will remove or at least minimize the time gating. It also seems like the story has a more solid direction so far, and from what we've seen, they've improved on gameplay mechanics, so let's hope it lives up to the hype when Shadowlands releases later this year.